My introduction to the influence of Asian art on American art really happened with my work with Morris Graves, who was a reclusive figure in the Pacific Northwest. And I went to teach at Humboldt State College then in Arcata, where Graves lived in a compound, and walked into my studio one night at about 10 o'clock, and I had admired his work as a child at the Museum of Modern Art. They own 38 pieces. They almost never exhibit them. And I think my first remarks to Morris were, "I thought you were dead." But eventually, we had a friendship, and he came to visit us in New Hampshire. He was an extraordinarily reclusive person, a complicated person. That's a kind word for could be very difficult. And the fact that I was able to do that project with him at the invitation of the Phillips Collection is kind of a miracle. But I got through it and was able to write the catalog. And my introduction to John Cage happened through Morris Graves. Morris Graves and John Cage knew each other in Seattle in the late 1930s when Cage was hired as percussionist at the Cornish School of Art. They became friends. They lived in the same apartment house on one floor above. John was married to Xenia then. Morris was famous for his Dada antics and pranks he would pull. For an introvert who did not like attention, he managed to make himself the center of attention wherever he went. And that friendship, which also included the 15-year-old Merce Cunningham at that time, lasted for the years. If I hadn't been able to accomplish that project with Morris, I don't think John Cage ever would have worked with me. It's that simple. They were so awed that Morris would cooperate with anybody. So that said, I met Steve and Addiss around 1985 at an exhibition I was in the University of Richmond. And we didn't really know each other, and I didn't know of his connection to Cage. But he knew that I had begun working with Cage in 1983 when I did a mycological foray. The way to get Cage to come to Mountain Lake, which is a remote mountaintop lake in the Appalachian Mountains, one of the two natural lakes in Virginia, was owned by Mary Moody Northern. Mary Moody Northern was one of the Dowager Empresses of Texas, like Amalu Hague. She kept the hotel open for years when there were no guests because she went there for 2 weeks in the summer. And I was trespassing on the property painting landscape all the time. And landscape is fairly critical to my interest in Japanese scrolls. And I would be rounded up by the groundskeeper and thrown off. And one day the groundskeeper's wife said, "Why don't you write to this individual in Galveston who was raised here in Parisburg near Mountain Lake and just ask permission to paint here?" And I did. Gene Lucas was his name. He was the president of Galtex, one of the 57 corporations Mrs. Northern owned. And suddenly I had free run of the place. And people from her family and her came up and recognized they could revitalize the property. And luckily it fell under the guiding hand of an individual who did not environmentally destroy this 3,000 acre compound that hadn't changed since the 1920s. I worked there on a series of conferences, theoretical criticism conferences that we did in the fall. They were called the Mountain Lake Symposium. When you live in a place as remote as I felt I was living in at the time, I was going to New York, and for 15 years I commuted from New York to Blacksburg, to Roanoke. But I began bringing people down to the Blacksburg area and up to Mountain Lake, and we did some pretty intense conferences over a period of a decade. We did 2 a year, seems impossible to me now. The spring conference was about artists. I found I could never get the artists to talk about their work. their motives, their artistic motive. They showed their work, and they talked about its proximity to big ideas and things, but they never necessarily came out from behind the veil and talked about their artistic motivation. So I began doing collaborations with artists at the time I would invite an artist to come down to work in a different medium, using the community I was living in, whether it was the traditional community or the high-tech community at Virginia Tech, to engage them in a different discipline that then they would, over the course of a week or sometimes 2 weeks, do something new, something different. For John, who came in 1983 because he was a co-founder of the New York Mycological Association, Orson Miller, who at the time had the greatest field book in the country on mushrooms, John and Orson knew of one another but had never met. So I found the captious bait to feed Cage that got him to come. And it was a great experience. During that experience, I took him to a spot on the New River where he really liked the flat stones. And we gathered up some of these stones, probably not the right thing to do, but and I took them to him in New York. And we talked about doing a watercolor workshop. And he said, oh, how could I do that? I mean, my friends who are artists have all these assistants. They have all these people helping them with everything. It's just out of the question. So before he left town for that first visit for the mycological foray, I took all the materials in my studio, papers, paints, brushes, and things, and I arranged them so John could have, if he wanted, a painting experience in the hour he had to lay over before we took him to the airport. And he did. He painted 3 paintings, one of which was a finished painting. Well, 5 years later, he came to do the painting workshop. Now, Steve had worked with John Cage when John taught at the New School for Social Research. He was the equivalent of a teaching assistant, so to speak. I don't know what that means in Cagean terms. That means he took attendance, and John didn't care about things like attendance. And John was very good at students bouncing their ideas off him and him essentially giving them permission through encouragement to do something about that. They would often ask him if he wanted to work with them on something. He would turn it around. I think it's a great teaching strategy, and it worked because he had quite a variety of people in those composition classes. Not a lot of them, but enough. I met Addiss after I had organized an exhibition of John Cage at the Phillips Collection. It was the second exhibition that I did with them. The watercolor was hardly dry. I mean, we finished the paintings. This almost never happens in the museum world, but it's a lot like this exhibition. Usually exhibitions are planned 3 and 4 years out, minimum. Not 6 months out, right? And Lachlan Phillips looked at it, and they immediately exhibited it, and that was the beginning of John's association with painting, which he wanted to do. All I had done was I organized a studio practice for him. My interest in Ōtagaki Rengetsu has indirectly a great deal to do with Addiss because I went to the University of Richmond probably by 1988 or 90 and saw a beautiful exhibition of Japanese art, scrolls, a variety of artists, a number of women too, and her work was just riveting. I didn't know anything about Japanese art at the time. In particular, I just liked them. I had begun collecting. When I graduated from here, I went to the West Coast for a job where I met Graves, et cetera, et cetera. When I went back to New York, I became a delivery boy for Alan Stone, the gallery that represented me. I like to refer to myself as a delivery boy because the first big project I did was a photography show of Southern photographers that Philip Haynes backed. And so in that sense, he was my first underwriter. When I saw the Rengetsu pieces, I just loved them. And I met a few years later Steve. And so we talked about this. It turned out it was his work. He had curated the show, and he owned most of those pieces. And a friendship then developed, and I invited Steve to the Mountain Lake Workshop to do a couple projects of his own. Now, I'm going to describe those in brevity because they're all very Cage-centric. I haven't meant to make this talk about Cage exactly, but can we go to, am I supposed to do something? Yeah, I never get any better at this. No. Yeah. When I was living in Seattle, and Paul and I talked about this last night, I spent 4 months there as a guest of Marshall and Helen Hatch, meeting people, doing research, trying to find out the background of Morris Graves. And in the course of that visit, I went to Bellingham to a junk store, and I bought this scroll, which I really thought was captivating. I didn't see a lot of scrolls in people's collections, and I think Morgan makes a great point in something you wrote in relationship to this exhibition, that when you go to the Met, for instance, you see framed European paintings, and especially in the modern sections, you see, all kinds of very differing kinds of works, but you never see scrolls. You never see Asian art, I don't really understand that. My fascination with the scroll was almost as important as my fascination, which I thought this was an enso. This is really a diamond. It's a kensuki, is that what they call it? Yeah. It's a related format. And I didn't know what it said, but it was beautiful. $20, so I bought it. And architectonically, when you hang one of these in your room, in a house, it relates to the architectonic qualities of the house. I don't know, maybe it was just because it was fresh for me. I wasn't seeing it in a thick gilt European frame. I was seeing it as a very, very fragile, simple structure that seemed to reach outside of the space of itself. Unlike what you see in Japan, where a scroll like this would be in a tokonoma, which is a little alcove in a room, it might have a flower arrangement below it. Depending on what guest you were going to be having over, or depending on the change of the season or change of clothes, you would change that scroll periodically. Well, I have had at one time or another 75 scrolls hanging on the walls. And the very Western way of looking at them. It's more hallucinatory. I wanted to show you this because this is where it started, and I didn't care that I didn't know what it said. It turns out it's kind of a letter of thanks of some sort to a mentor. I have a partial translation of it. Next slide, please. Yeah, that's the title of the talk. There you go. The first project I did with Steve has a complex history. In 1989, Cage was in Virginia, and again had a very short time before his flight, 2.5 hours, and John would paint if the workshop came up with something completely new or different for him to do. He didn't like repeating himself. It doesn't make sense to me because I don't know how it applies to his music. It seems like he did repeat himself quite a bit. But I came up with an idea that's based in Robert Rauschenberg's tire track. We just would put a big piece of paper on the floor, and 2 pans of paint at the end of it. And if he stepped out of those pans, he could do whatever he wanted. What he did was he stepped out of the pans and walked backwards, pulling a specially made brush that was, I think, 56 inches wide across the tracks of his footsteps. Did we ever get one of the images downloaded of Cage's original steps that's in the Bremen Kunsthalle?
I'm not sure, you'll have to see.
Okay, we'll just have to see. So this shows you the trough, and it doesn't show you the brush, but there's 2 pans. I was in touch with the John Cage Trust at Bard College, that I'm now on the board of, and it was decided by Laura Kuhn and other members, because John died in 1992, that this was a legitimate performance piece and needed to be documented. So I wrote the notation for it, which was then published by C.F. Peters, John's publisher in Zurich. The first performance of John Cage's Steps, a composition for a painting to be performed by individuals and groups, which is what we used to call it, before the publication in 1970, that was in 2017, was going to be performed by Stephen Addiss because of his appropriateness to perform it. He was the right person to do it. He had worked with Cage, he admired Cage. This was our first project. Next slide, please. I set it up. There's the brush. Something else I have to give away now. And he enacted 2 performances of Cage's Steps, fairly correspondent to what Cage did. Since then, there have been many performances of Steps, and the way the notation is written, that are done all kinds of different ways. Yeah. And next slide. Do you want me to do that? You just have to show me what button.
That
I'm capable of that.
Oh, sure.
Oh, the forward button, okay. Yeah. So hopefully we're going to end today's program with a very short video where Steve talks about this experience, because I wanted you to hear his voice. Sumi 1, an obvious name, since we never can come up with names. Sumi 2. He gave me one of these paintings. The idea of the Mountain Lake Workshop was everything was given to the artist. And if the artist wanted to, the artist gave something back. My workshop, by the way, had nothing to do with Virginia Tech. They didn't sponsor it. I raised all my own money, wrote all my own grants. That's not to say they weren't interested in it. They just weren't going to pay for anything. Steve is putting his seal on here. This sort of cemented our friendship. And there are the 2 paintings. I had the first one, and I've given it away already. And this is Sumi 2. And you can just barely discern his footsteps, which, if we do have a picture of Cage's original, and he wanted to wear his shoes, they're very distinct. It's almost like the passage of the individual through life, And there's one, which is now at Longwood University. Another significant project I did with Steve was based on deconstructing Cage's writings, but also the ideal of the ox herding pictures. I compare them to Giotto because people could go to the Arena Chapel and see pictures on the wall and understand something about the life of Christ, The ox herding pictures were ideal for kind of a semi-illiterate population. You look at them and you see in them a demonstration of a spiritual paradigm, finding yourself. I pulled out of a drawer in my studio when Steve was visiting a pile of paper towels that John had used in 1988, yes, as tryouts. We ran out of paper for him to try the brush out with. You know, he painted originally with feathers because he didn't want the paintings to look conventional. Series 4, the first painting he did, Series 4, number 1, was his first experience in the last 2 days of his workshop of painting with brushes. A brush is a stick with hair on the end, you know, and there's lots of ways to make an image. I used to have my students make brushes by cutting each other's hair off, and I would get the ferrules, they'd find a stick and prepare it all, and then there'd always be 2 or 3 kids in the class whose hair was just perfect for brushes. And this was another meeting with the dean, by the way. Yeah. Just like smoking paper, the photographs make it look like the students are in the fire. Another meeting with the dean. I mean, that is the level of involvement that Tech had. The paper towels just were wonderful. He would just, you know, he would try to get the brush to have just the right weight on it. Now, this is an interesting observation about Cage, because Cage used chance, and but he also liked to understand what he was doing. So whether it was engraving with Catherine Brown at Catherine's Crown Point Press, he was always trying to get better at it. I know this seems like a contradiction for somebody who's an anarchist, right? And he got involved with using tryout sheets, holding the brush, wanting the mixtures of paint were by 10% increments. Everything was mixed. And these paper towels looked so beautiful. They were probably 25 years old when I found them in a closet at the Hortons studio, Miles and Ruth Horton, which I used. It was adjacent to Mountain Lake. And I said to him at the time, I said, wow, look at these paper towels. They're just fantastic. We should do something with these. And he said, you do something with them. Well, that's actually, there's a tradition of that with him. I was intimidated by the remark. I didn't bring it up again. I saved the paper towels. And Laura Kuhn explained to me, she said, well, you know, he often did that. He means it. He means do something with it. But I could never really figure out what to do with them until Addiss came along. We'll get to Rengetsu and Nantenbō soon. Yeah. You can see why I felt this way. Steve's standing there in the studio. I'm showing him the paper towels. And I said, why don't you select a group to be ox herding pictures? And he set right to it. There are 5 sets. This is set 1. Some of the sets were chosen using chance operations because we had the Cornell University computerized printout of that, which is what Cage used. Cage started out, you know, with stones and sticks and throwing things. It took forever. And Cornell University developed a computerized program for him eventually. By the way, about the I Ching, which his program is based in, we never talked about the I Ching. We never talked about Buddhism. We never talked about Eastern religion. Nothing. Like, it was all doing. It's very Zen in that sense. I just wanted to share these with you. The inscriptions you see on the right, and this is a big job for Steve. He went through all of Cage's writings, and using methods of chance, he selected, with chance operations, these combinations of words that each line is a takeout, you know, of something. And it really works. So it got published immediately. George Braziller published it, who had done my Graves book. Am I leaving these long enough for you to read them? Isn't the parallelism, though, in a way, with what we see in Rengetsu nice? Yeah. Nothing. Returning to the source. Nothing's changed yet, something immense that adds up to zero. And entering the marketplace. That means returning to the village, bountiful, giving. The tendency toward the good that Daichi Suzuki would talk to Cage about. John would say, what did he mean by that? Uh-oh. Okay, let's see what happens here now. Yes, I wanted to show you this. The other thing Steve was fascinated with was fire. And Catherine Brown had done a series of prints where they threw some burning newspaper underneath the press. And sometimes it would make imprimatur a part of the words. He liked that because he associated that with Rauschenberg also. This is what I mean about the dean calling me in. People would get the hair off their arms burned and eyelashes and things, but they didn't. They loved this. I've done this as this is one of the runouts that we still do. The Mountain Lake Workshop, we smoke paper and things. That's why I gave you that huge figure for my customary fee, because it usually involves workshops in several days. This is a 101-inch wide piece of rag paper. You can't buy it anymore. And it's 33 feet long. And the Mountain Lake assistants, all of whom are bonded and who I'm still in touch with, all of them, figured out a way to smoke this. John had painted a painting previous to this called New River Rocks and Washes with the big brushes. We now had 7 or 8 of them that we built for him. And it's almost dark. It's funny what digital photography will do. Looks like daylight, but it's getting dark, and the wind is rising. John said at one point, this is like Irish tragedy. Because the first big piece of paper that we tried just ripped up in the wind at about $300 a piece. I wanted you to see that. Now, he painted the identical configuration of rocks that he had done in New River Rocks and Washes, now officially called River Rocks and Washes and River Rocks and Smoke. But this, he wanted the paint much lighter this time. So here you see him actually doing this. Now, we had assistants that would come and pick the rock up, put the rock down, everything was handed off immediately because he's 76 years old or something here. I just thought I'd share these with you. These are about this big. Now, John and Dominique de Menil bought this painting immediately. It was practically a month later. Adelaide de Menil bought New River Rocks and Washes and immediately lost it for 27 years. And we only found it when we showed it a year just before COVID, right? At the Rauschenberg Gallery in Fort Myers. I mean, we just couldn't. It was in a tube that hadn't been properly marked. The Menils owned so much stuff stored all over the country that it's not uncommon for this type of thing to happen. Sean Mooney, who's her curator, tirelessly searched one location after another, and he found that painting. Now the Manil has both of them. They're going to take the rocks, they're taking the big trough, the big brush, all the things we used, and they'll exhibit them. So here's John contemplating what he's done. We would arrive there at 7:30 in the morning, and it's a 35-minute drive from Blacksburg. He'd already be up and in the studio. And then he'd want to play chess until 11 o'clock. Or I would take him into town and he'd want to visit the architecture college. And he would visit students' desks. Some of them knew who he was, some of them didn't, you know. He originally in life studied architecture. He thought he wanted to be an architect. It's a little heated up as a slide, but that's it. Yeah. It's a parade. His dream about it was that there would be a parade of rocks. It has a kinship to steps in that sense. Now, before the video, I should say a little bit about Rengetsu and Nakahara and Nantenbō. They're interesting artists. Steve did find some evidence that they were well aware of one another. They did know of one another. Whether they met, because of the age difference. She lives 8 years into the Meiji period. They lived through the golden age of the Edo period, where the country wasn't covered with skirmish wars between the shoguns, you know. They were both emperor loyalists, both of them. She dies in 1875, and Nantenbō, who reinvigorates and reinvents Zen Buddhist practice based on the most traditional Chan and Taoist practices in China, where he studied for 2 years, brought that back to life in Japan and recreated the Zen Buddhist culture, monastic culture. That's what he's credited for. It's interesting, they're two conservatives who are in their own way radical. The staff, which someone else will explain, I hope, came from a Nandina bush he saw in Kyushu and begged the, you have to, well, we're not ready to show that. I should finish talking about it. Yeah, and I told Steve how I felt about these Rengetsus, and I began to go online and look for them, and suddenly I would find little auctions going on in Japan and shops of Rengetsu paint strips, a very conventional kind of strip. You'll see examples in the gallery with her calligraphy on it and her poetry. And eBay is the last place in the world you'd expect to find this. But remember, we're in a transitional period. Grandchildren go into the grandparents' house. They're there for about 10 minutes looking at things. They throw their hands up in the air and they call the liquidator. The liquidator comes, and these things are currently appearing everywhere. This will stop at some point. The same thing happened after the Shah of Iran. New York was loaded with Iranian carpets and things. Lasted about 3 years. And you could buy them on 25th Street in those, you know, markets, outdoor markets. And I had Steve to talk to. I'd say, look at this thing. And he'd look at it and he said, looks good to me. The first one I bought was so wrecked. It's still my favorite. I don't care about condition issues. So, as I said, working for Alan Stone, I kind of had to become a collector because Alan and Bill Acquavella, Ruben, Bob Minuchin, and Leo Castelli were the kind of people I delivered to. They were hooked. They had to open galleries in some of their cases because they were so over-involved with collecting. Leo never cared about money. He would he'd give a $25 million Jasper Johns away, and I think when he died, he had $3 million in the bank. But I want to stop this now, don't I? Yeah. Nantenbō, I didn't know much about him. I of course, would do some research. I just loved the scripting. He's self-taught, apparently. Also, he prided himself on doing a painting in less than a minute. And there are probably 100,000 Nantenbōs, maybe. Then there might be 35,000 Rengetsus. Rengetsu didn't like it when wealthy patrons came along and wanted to commission 20, 30 pieces from her. She said, money can't buy culture, you know. She often inscribed the pots of other potters because if she did her thumbnail inscriptions of her poetry on them, they could sell them. So you always wonder, well, who made the pot? Maybe it's easier to tell which Paul will know about, if that's her thumbnail or not. But I charged ahead in this, and Steve looked at almost everything I bought until the very end. And I think I still have 3 or 4 Nantenbōs, and I have 10 or 11 Rengetsus. And I love them. Looking in here, I miss them. With that said, I collected a lot of other scrolls. I think I have about 130 or 40. I don't think some of them are very significant at all. The second scroll I bought, by the way, after buying that jewel, was in an Osaka department store. I didn't have any, I liked it. It was a landscape. I was interested in the vertical landscape because I was painting horizontal landscapes. And they fit so much narrative into that vertical space. It's almost a completely different idea about storytelling narrative space than Western landscaping, I painted outdoors for 4 years, through all 4 seasons, almost every day, to teach myself about color, because Neil Welliver said to me one day, green is just a color I keep in a jar. And I didn't want green to be a color I kept in a jar. Should we show the video now? I think this is... This is Stephen Addiss performing steps, and he talks a little bit about the character of the painting. We always made John hold the brush. He often said it didn't matter who held the brush.
Well, first of all, I can say that I studied with Cage for several years back in the, I was trying to think of the years, 1958 to 1960 or 61, during the very rare time that he actually taught. He taught at the New School in New York City. And one of the things he commented was that for him, art was a doing, leaving traces. So this is a perfect example of that. It's actually the doing, the experience, and then whatever is left is the traces that that activity took place.
Okay, whenever you're ready. It's close to the reversion. This is sponsored by Capital One, Glen Allen, Virginia.
One interesting thing for me, I realized, of course, that it was going to be much darker and richer in ink at the end, and then have what's called flying white, where you see the white of the paper right through the brushstroke more as we go along. And it seemed to me that when I was making it, that the footprints were being totally obliterated by all the ink.
Yeah.
It's so nice to see that they weren't.
This is the second one.
If you lift up a little bit on the two, it'll just kind of flat. Check out the slide.
Are there any questions? I think that's the end of what. Thank you very much.